Bonjour, Wache Anin. Welcome to Lakehead University's Global Indigenous Speaker Series. We are happy that you could join us today. Denise Baxter, Indigenous, Makwadodam, Martin Falls, and Donjaba. My name is Denise Baxter, Vice Provost, Indigenous Initiatives at Lakehead University. I'm a member of Martin Falls First Nation in Northern Ontario, Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe, and I will be your MC for this event today. Lakehead University remains committed to social justice and social responsibility. Lakehead University will continue to advance the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action and the University Canada Principles on Indigenous Education. And so this series today is part of our commitment to that. Lakehead University respectfully acknowledges its campuses are located on the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples in this area. Lakehead University Thunder Bay, where I am right now, is located on the traditional lands of Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty. Australia is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. Lakehead University acknowledges the history that many nations hold in the areas around our campuses and is committed to a relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples based on the principles of mutual trust, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration in the spirit of reconciliation. Before we begin, I would like to do a quickly run through a few housekeeping items. There is an important notice of video audio recording of the Global Indigenous Speaker Series. Participants are reminded this is an online event and it is being recorded. We are doing this to preserve a record of the event in the university's archives and to publicize and promote the work happening at Lakehead University. By attending, you are agreeing to be included in the recording and its public dissemination in any media now known or later developed anywhere in the world in perpetuity. You do have the option to stop your video if you would like. It is now my pleasure to introduce Elder Beatrice Twans-Hines from Bittigong First Nation, Anishinaabe territory, who will share an opening prayer and song. Welcome, Beatrice.
Bonjour. So I'm going to light the smudge while I'm doing this and saying the prayer. The smudge out. Bonjour minoa gijem nedo meshom sak nok mesak danaway maganak wabish kobebego je manato equain indigenous kichimigizi quain indigenous gaye makwato dame. Hello again, Creator, grandfathers, grandmothers, all my relations. My name is White Horse Spirit Woman. I'm also called Big Eagle Woman, and I'm from the Bear Clan, and I'm from Bittigong First Nation near Big River. Thank you, Creator, for all that you have created. Thank you, Grandfather Sun, for shining on us today. Thank you, Grandmother Moon, for shining on us at night. Thank you, Mother Earth, for giving us life and for giving us food. Thank you, Mother Earth, for giving us life, for giving us food, for giving us water, and for giving us the animals. And for giving us breath. Seman and Bugdina, Kiwedanong, Wabanong, Jawanong, Minwa, Ipingashmuk. I offer my tobacco to the north, east, south, and to the west. Without emotion, Jimishko Gabuyan Minwa Jizong Deyan. Help me, help us to stand strong and to have a strong heart. And Creator, I ask you to bless each one of us, bless all the instructors and helpers at the universities and the instructors and all those who are presenting today, and bless all the families as well. Help us to keep safe from that virus. Miigwech, 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 miigwech. I'm going to sing a song. It's called Calling in the Four Grandfathers. It's asking the grandfathers of the four directions to help us and to be with us here. Miigwech. Anonymous showmiss, Indigen wheaty sheet namuma. Ya hey ya hey ya hey ya hey ya hey hey ya hey ya hey ya hey hey. Now anonymous showmiss, Indigen wheaty sheet namuma. Ya hey ya hey ya ya hey ya hey ya hey hey ya hey ya hey ya hey hey. Be when long the show miss, being again, hey, she mama. Yeah, 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 hey, hey, yeah, hey, hey, hey. Waiting on the show miss, being again, hey, she mama. Yeah, 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 yeah. Miigwech. And just to let you know that I'm not able to stay for the talk, so I will be leaving, and I wish you all the best. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Elder Beatrice. It was always appreciated. Love the song. And I believe we are coming from really four corners of the world today. And so I really appreciate you calling in the four grandfathers. Miigwech. It is my pleasure to introduce our President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Maura McPherson, who will share some welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much, Denise, and good morning, bonjour, buenos dias to everyone this morning. And I'd like to start first by saying thank you to Elder Beatrice as well for her prayer and her beautiful song to start us off this morning. Welcome everyone to the very first event of Lakehead University's Global Indigenous Speaker Series. And the purpose of this series is to help share Indigenous knowledge approaches to contemporary issues and to use these to understand and address non-Indigenous issues by helping us reimagine how we perceive our futures. Today, it is our very real pleasure and honor to host Jorge Miguel Cocum Peche. Mr. Cocum Peche is a native speaker of the Mayan Peninsular Language, and we are really, really pleased to have him here today as our inaugural guest speaker. Mr. Peche writes narrative poetry and essays, and he's joining us direct from Mexico City. Reading from a selection of his works, he will exchange ideas on the importance of reverting to ancestral knowledge and customs to face critical issues of our time. So, on behalf of Lakehead University, I extend a very, very warm welcome to you, Mr. Peche. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President McPherson. We are joined today by also Minister Counselor Shauna Hemingway of the Canadian Embassy in Mexico. Minister Counselor Shauna Hemingway received her BA in Honors Economics and History at the University of Toronto in 1999. She then joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in 2002. At headquarters, she has worked as a trade policy negotiator responsible for investment treaty and free trade agreement negotiations with partners in Asia. She also served as Trade Commissioner responsible for Mexico. Most recently, Ms. Hemingway held the position of Deputy Director of the G7 G20 Summits Division. Overseas, she has served as Ambassador to the Dominican Republic, as Political Secretary accredited to North and South Korea, and Economic Counselor at Canada's Embassy in Mexico City. Before joining the Foreign Service, she worked as a journalist in Canada and Communications Manager in England. We would like to acknowledge her support of this event through collaborative planning and translation services provided for us today. Welcome, Minister Counselor Shauna Hemingway.
Thank you so very much, Denise. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Buenos días, es un placer acompañarlos en el día de hoy. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi de vous accueillir ce matin depuis Mexico. A big thanks to Lakehead University for this initiative. Your presence, even if it is virtual today, sends a positive signal on the importance of deepening our friendship and partnerships with Mexico in the international education sphere, and more specifically with regards to Indigenous education. El valor de estas iniciativas solo aumenta frente a los desafíos comunes de COVID. Desde la Embajada de Canadá en México, dedicamos buena parte de nuestros esfuerzos en materia cultural a fortalecer el cambio de buenas prácticas, intercambio de buenas prácticas, la colaboración artística y la creación de redes entre los pueblos indígenas de México y Canadá. Así, la tradición milenaria de los pueblos indígenas, raíz de nuestros dos países, es y debe ser uno de los mayores motivos para celebrar y fortalecer nuestras relaciones bilaterales. Creo que este evento hoy día demuestra la creciente fortaleza de los vínculos entre Canadá y México. No nos unen únicamente los lazos comerciales, políticos y académicos que hemos construido durante décadas, sino un presente y pasado indígenas. La movilidad de estudiantes indígenas entre México y Canadá ha crecido durante los últimos años. Desde 2013, más de 350 estudiantes indígenas han participado en algún tipo de intercambio académico. Esto ayuda a fomentar el conocimiento acerca de la diversidad de nuestros países. Asimismo, hace posible un análisis más profundo de la riqueza de estas culturas que constituyen Canadá y México. Canadá continuará emprendiendo acciones efectivas en su territorio y en el extranjero con el objetivo de fomentar y proteger los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Tan importante. Por parte de la Embajada de Canadá en México, estamos muy orgullosos de ser parte de este diálogo y les deseo una conversación fructífera y productiva. Muchísimas gracias y bienvenidos, bienvenidas todos y todas.
Gracias, thank you, merci. Councillor Minister Hemingway. Again, we really appreciate your support of our event today.
And muy importante para nosotros. It's very important and a real pleasure for us to participate. Thank you for inviting us to be part of the initiative.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce our invited guest lecturer, Jorge Miguel Cocum Peche. Jorge Miguel Cocum Peche is a native speaker of the Mayan Peninsular language. He was born in Calquini, Campeche, Mexico in 1952. He now lives in Mexico City and writes narrative, poetry, and essays. He has published several books, including one he just shared with us earlier today. Some of the titles are Secrets of Grandfather in 2001 and 2006, The 9 Questions in 2012, grandfather Gregorio, a Mayan sage, in 2012. Golden Tears here, do not speak Mayan, 2013. And Mix of a Dog in 2017. He has been a member of Mexico's National System of Art Creators in 2009 and 2014, and he has received the following awards. The Grand International Poetry Prize of 2005, awarded by the East-West Academy of Romania, the Indigenous Literatures Award of America, 2016, at the prestigious Guadalajara Book Fair, and he was granted Poet of the Year Award in 2016 by the Americas Poetry Festival of New York. His lyrical work has been published in anthologies in Mexico and the world. And I am very privileged, honored, and pleased to welcome Jorge Miguel Cocum Peche to share with us today. Welcome.
First of all, I'd like to extend the joy of my soul and my heart to you. I'm very happy to be here with you. I'm very happy to be a part of this project in which Indigenous languages of the American continent will have an opportunity to display themselves, and that it can be a part of the cultural exchange between Mexico and the rest of Latin America. I understand that once a month you're going to be holding sessions similar to this one with other writers from the American continent, because there are a lot of us. In Mexico, we started to recover our roots, our ancient words in the 40s of the previous century. Obviously, in the 16th century, the Franciscan friars, some of whom learned our languages, left a testimony of the daily lives or of what was happening during the conquest. And it was one of the first ways in which we could speak about what was happening to us. And it's also very important for us to be able to express ourselves so that we can express our experiences, our desires, our wishes, how we live, how we're happy living through this stage of globalization. Because we cannot remain isolated. We have to be incorporated into that process, but try to find a way to dampen the negative impact. We can't flee it. Nobody can flee the future. Ultimately, the future will catch up with us. It will be present. And it is always very fleeting anyhow. The present is something we can never really grasp in our hands, but it's important to be able to be in the present. May I begin? All right. What can we say here in Mexico? Well, I was saying that in the previous century, in the 40s, in two cultures, the Zapotec culture and the Mayan culture, which is in the peninsula of Yucatan, we started a process in which we were trying to recover our languages and our literature through putting it on writing. We were doing it in everything in writing. The Zapotecs did quite a bit in that sense, a lot. They wanted to leave evidence of their language through literature, written language, and there were very many distinguished writers. One of them died recently. That's a sarcasm, because he died 103 or 104 years ago. In 43, 42, in Yucatan, we started to publish a magazine called Jicaltran. And in that magazine or that journal, in addition to covering different subjects, they also published bilingual texts as well as texts that were completely in Mayan that weren't translated, but they were an example of what Maya sounded like back then. Back then, the Spanish that we spoke in the peninsula, in the Yucatan, at least in my community, was a Mayanized Spanish. They took a lot of words on loan from the Mayan language, and it was a different way of looking at the world. It was a hybrid way of looking at the world, in which we were seeing the merging of two languages, and that's been happening over the years. And now, 50 years later, we have in a significant portion of our Mayan language, we have a Spanish-ish Mayan, let's say. And so it's totally different. Everything's been flipped. What used to be a Spanish that was influenced by Mayan is now a Mayan that is influenced by Spanish. Fortunately, there are a lot of variations of the Mayan language in the Yucatan. And so in the more far-flung communities, they still preserve, perhaps not the purest version of Mayan, but they still have some certain nuances that are typical of our Mayan language. That is to say, the language continues with what everybody had heard of in the past. And that's something that really pleases us, because we believe that we have to be very careful to not try to standardize our languages. We want to maintain all of our languages alive in writing and orally, but there are a lot of variations in our languages, a lot of dialects. And that's helpful, because if there's one word or term in one dialect that can't be translated into another, we should preserve it. And we can also use it in case if the syntax is different in one dialect or another. That helps us to ensure that we protect the wealth of the languages we have and the richness that they have to offer us. It's important to be able to have a common language, but we also have to be very cautious about making sure that all of the variations of our dialects survive, because that is a privilege for our languages to be able to do that. It's like wild plants, wildflowers that grow in the fields. We should continue to preserve them. That's another one of the things that we're trying to do, because sometimes there are those who feel that we have to standardize everything. But no, there would be no point to doing that. The point is for us to have a language that we can all agree on in writing, but we can accept at the same time the dialects, because that is part of the richness that our languages have, and it expresses what each community has to offer. So here right now in Mexico, as you probably know, or I assume that many of you know, in Mexico we speak 68 languages. There's still 68 indigenous languages that are very much alive. At the start of the previous century, there were 120, almost 130 languages. So in one century, half of those languages were lost. Half of those languages disappeared in those 100 years, because at the start of the previous century, many more languages were spoken. Fortunately, over the past few years, the past 30 years, let's say, thanks to the pressure, the social indigenous pressure, and because of the struggles that we've had, the situation has changed. Now we're making an effort to make sure that they may stay alive. The Mexican government has a policy in place to protect them, and not just protect them, but also safeguard them through the use of different public policies, and that's important. But we also have to be very clear. A language stays alive if it's spoken at home. Its first habitat, our homes, which is why it's so important to refer to the home or the house of your soul. When you stop speaking a language at home, that language is condemned to disappear at some point. We, when we were children, would speak it in our homes. We would speak it out on the streets, at school. At school, it was a little bit different, because back then there was a policy in place in the 60s, for example, in which we weren't supposed to speak our indigenous languages at school. And so if you went against that idea, we were violently repressed. Sometimes they would hit us. But those days are over, fortunately. Now the Mexican state and certain states all over the world are making a specific effort to safeguard our indigenous languages. And it's wonderful to have and indigenous languages because they speak of the world differently. They give it different names, and it's a spirit that we have to preserve because that is the way we can preserve everything. Preserve all the voices that we have, because we're all different voices, but we all complement each other. And the way in which we look at the world differently is very helpful. For example, we have a lot of plants that are helpful to heal, to physically heal our bodies, which in other parts of the world don't exist. Much in the same way that in other parts of the world they have plants that are used to heal the body and soul of the people and that are very helpful. And so to name those things with our languages and to safeguard them is also something that helps the planet and helps humans. I was saying that in the previous century there were two movements in different cultures to safeguard our languages. In the 70s, a group of indigenous teachers got together and they created an association of writers, and we made an initial effort to have a group. It still continues, by the way, the association still exists, in which we could recover our indigenous language through literature. It continues. Now there are even more writers. Now we have a policy, a state policy, which we had previously, but hopefully now, in spite of the economic restrictions we're facing, that they will provide us even with even more aid. First of all, so that we can safeguard our indigenous languages, as well as to make sure that in that process we can preserve other cultural expressions that take place in our communities, in our towns, and that express themselves through culture and education. That is also very important. Regardless of the fact that there are 68 languages, indigenous languages, still being spoken here in Mexico, we've seen that many of those languages are starting to recover or to take back ground in the possibility of being used for poetry, essays. In Tzotzil and in the Peninsular Mayan, for example, in the past century, Enrique Pérez, I don't remember what his other last name is, I think it's Lope, started together with Javier Gómez Navarrete to make an effort to write sonnets. That was a rigorous process, by the way. I almost sonnets, to tell you the truth, because sonnets have a metric system that is very demanding. There is, for example, the need to have an accent on the 10th syllable, for example, and so on. But our indigenous languages, through those two poets, were able to experience that possibility of being written in sonnets, to have indigenous sonnets, and that was very novel. Now in Mexico, we can say that only one newspaper, La Jornada in Mayan, publishes on its back page news exclusively in the Mayan language. They include different types of news articles, but it's entirely in Maya. And that really pleases us because it's the only means of communication in Mexico. I don't know if that's the case for the entire continent, in which they make an effort to allow us to write in our languages in their pages. And so we've made some progress. Hopefully other countries, other regions in Mexico, and other newspapers will be willing to at least give the news in indigenous languages and to read them. The translator that we have in Yucatan is a brilliant woman called Cecil Sanchez. She's the one who does the translations, and she also edits the notes, the articles that are published on the Jornada Maya version. And hopefully other means of communication will give us the opportunity of continuing to preserve our languages. Insofar as safeguarding the language in the Yucatan, we have a learning system in place, a teaching system in place in which we use internet. There are programs, for example, recent programs, maybe they're just 1 or 2 years old, that are called Learn Mayan on WhatsApp. And now they're teaching Mayan, and there are a lot of young people that are learning through WhatsApp. And WhatsApp also lets them record, not just to have everything in writing, but also for everybody to be able to hear what is in writing. And that is also very helpful. I believe that these types of platforms are very helpful and that they're going to aid us in safeguarding our languages. And that it's not just going to be the Mexican state, at least here in Mexico, to have to invest a lot of money in the Indigenous Education Department or for other specific institutions that have been created to that purpose to make investments. Rather, all the rest of us can also help to contribute to safeguard and protect our languages, preserve them through WhatsApp or any other platform that's available here in Mexico. There are great poets in Mexico. For example, more women write poems in Mexico. There are more female poets than male poets, and that's wonderful. In narrative, it's different. There are more men writing narrative than women, but that's all right. It's okay. I've published 3 books. One of them I perhaps should not have published because it's got a lot of mistakes. I'm responsible for that, and I assume my responsibility that I shouldn't have published that book because it had a lot of mistakes in it. And yet, being able to recover our languages is not an easy feat. Some of us speak a language with certain variants, with more of a Spanish influence than others. And so we have to find a way to recover our language in that sense. That's one problem. There are others who learn the language very well, and now they're writing in that language. And then they're translating it into Spanish. What's most important here is that as time goes by, we improve the way in which we write, because sometimes we write in this effort to recover our languages. But it's also important that we, as Indigenous language writers, to be aware that we have to have those 2 linguistic skills to be able to write and write properly, because I've made mistakes, and that's why I'm admitting it. It's because it's something I've seen in my own experience. It's important to have the 2 linguistic skills, competencies in our languages, the Indigenous language and the terminal language, the original language and the terminal language. But not just that. In 2004, right, Pierre? Yes. In 2004, I went to BAM Center International, and I went to a literary translation course. And that's where I realized that my text had limitations. And thanks to the fact that I went to that course, afterwards they gave me a very serious critique, and they forced me to study linguistics in the National Institute of Anthropology and History, which is very important because it's key that we as writers have the basic knowledge, the foundations, and then with more criteria for us to be able to have proper use of our grammar, Spanish grammar, which is the case in Mexico, in which we speak Spanish and our indigenous language, as well as the grammar of our indigenous language, but above all to be aware of the living grammar, the grammar that is used by people who speak our languages, that gives life to our writing. Because on the one hand, they use terms that are no longer used or only used in small groups, and they also take into account what people, the language speakers, use, because languages are constantly changing. Every single day we take words on loan from other languages. In Spanish, for example, that happens. Initially, I said, and I insist, that our languages are structurally affected by Spanish, but we have to be aware of what's happening so that we can recover the syntax, the formal syntax, and have the type of writing that will be a true offering of the people who speak that language, so that we can slowly and gradually recover our languages and use the specific grammar of those languages. That's what I wanted to start with. And afterwards, if you have any questions, I would be happy to take them. I wouldn't like to limit myself to just one subject, and so I'd like to see if any of you have questions that I can answer in this dialogue, because I don't want to be the only parrot talking at this party. Denise, can we open the floor to questions? You will be coordinating, I understand. Sí, Pierre y yo vamos a estar coordinando las preguntas. Si hay preguntas, y si no, usted puede seguir hablando. Todavía nos quedan unos 35 minutos. Yes, but it would be helpful if you could tell me what you want me to say. I might be talking about linguistic issues that you might not be very interested in, but that's why I'd like to know if, for example, can we start by enriching the process? If you could ask a question, I much prefer it when people ask questions so I can answer them, because to use the following 20 minutes on other subjects that might not be of interest to you, maybe you're expecting something else from me. So if you were to ask me a question, I can focus more, and that way I can answer what you want to hear in this virtual session. So please. Bueno, si me permite, entonces quisiera referirme a algo que usted ya mencionó anteriormente. Se refirió a la tierra, a las plantas, a la naturaleza, nuestra conexión con nuestra salud, con nuestras estaciones y cómo vivimos como pueblos indígenas, cómo convivimos con la madre tierra. ¿Nos podría hablar un poquito más acerca de qué ve usted en esta conversación o este diálogo con la naturaleza y cómo está afectando la salud y la sustentabilidad, no solamente de nosotros los pueblos indígenas, sino también de todo el mundo? Yes, many years ago I read, when I was a student at the Autonomous University of Chapingo, because I studied agronomy, they asked me to read a book called Small is Beautiful, Lo Pequeño es Hermoso, and to go back to our communities, to go back to that sense of community that we've lost because of the sense of individuality we have is important. We have lost our being for our knowing and for our having. And that's something that we were taught as children. I was taught to first do. They taught me, this is ours, not mine. I lived in a community. And that's something that made me have a very happy childhood, because I knew that the land, because the earth belonged to all of us. And that whole sense of ownership wasn't clearly defined in that era, that magical era, that utopia that I experienced as a child. It wasn't very clearly defined. That term ownership wasn't clearly defined. We spoke more in terms of community, and that helps us in our being. We spend a lot of time with nature, which is why I refer to this book, in which they talk about the fact that small is beautiful. I would say that, I don't know if at some point people will flee the cities to go back to the fields, go back into the countryside, and to live in small communities. I don't know if that will ever happen. Because to sustain a city, you're sacrificing the countryside. I don't know what we'll have to do. Maybe in the long term that will be our destiny, in which we'll have to go back to living in small communities. In small communities, we all know each other. We all love each other. I've seen that happen. People have a name and you call people by their names, whereas in the city, you're a file, you're a number. And that's one of the things that has affected me. I live in Mexico City now because of medical issues, but here I'm a file number. In my community, in my town, I'm called Jorge. People have a sense of community there. And what's more, most importantly, you have an identity. And in the city, that sense of identity is lost. We sacrifice it. We sacrifice the communal for the individual. There's a culture that I love, something that I love in my town in Mexico, and when we have the sense of community. The Zapotec, the Mixtec, the people of the state of Oaxaca, I've even seen it in the States, in the US. They work with a sense of community, and that's an example for us and for all of us in terms of how we can recover our being through the sense of community. In my childhood, that's why I wrote the book, my grandfather Gregorio. It's something that I did in consultation with other writers, and after taking courses, translation courses, in this entire process of helping to recover the language, I realized that I would have to rewrite that book that I had written. I had to include the different variations of the language. But getting back to the subject, it's important that we try to recover our languages, but through this way of being, of seeing ourselves as a complementary face, not somebody that replaces somebody else. That's what happens in the cities. Our faces go fuzzy. We lose ourselves. But it seems that there's no other way of doing things. During many years, the Mexican state abandoned agriculture, and that led to many of the field workers having to go to the large cities. And they came as cheap labor for them, which is why it was a deliberately criminal policy on the part of the state. And so they expelled us from the countryside, and they forced us to come into the cities. I would have loved to have stayed in the country. When I was young, my father and my grandfather had a conflict because my father wanted me to go to school. My grandfather wanted me to stay in the countryside. My grandfather wanted me to learn about the rituals of the land and for me to be connected to the land and to the earth. My father wanted me to go to school because he wanted me to be different. And so there was a point in which there was a conflict, a family conflict, because my grandfather wanted me to work the land. He wanted me to be a field worker or a farmer like he was, or to have an orchard like he had an orchard where he had mango, guava trees. It was a beautiful orchard, and we would work the land growing beans, maize, zucchini, and that was something because my grandfather wanted me to learn how to subsist off the land. But my father wanted me to do something else. He wanted me to go to school. He wanted me to have a destiny different from his own. And they both won because I went to school. And then afterwards, I devoted my life to writing those beautiful passages of that idyllic world I had in my childhood, that paradise on earth that I had in the orchard, in the lands of my community. And I kept that. Nothing was lost. They both won. My father gave me life, but my grandfather, when I was able to practice the rituals with him, the ceremonies with him, when he told me the stories, he gave me my soul, the soul of my town, my people from whom I had inherited the love of language. I have another question. I hope you can hear me. What is the status of the Mayan language, the formal status of the language in public schools, particularly in Yucatan? And what can be done to promote or to encourage that the language be dynamically used, that Mayan language be dynamically used amongst the youth? Well, I don't have the hard numbers of the percentages in terms of how much is being done in Yucatan, but in Yucatan and Campeche, in those two states, for example, in Campeche, I know Luis Canono, who is the director of Indigenous Languages. He's a poet and musician, by the way. He's a very sensitive person, and I think he's doing a very good job there. I don't know who's in charge of that in Yucatan or Quintana Roo, those two other states. But the one in Campeche, he's always got a very conciliatory way of doing things. He's got something that very few politicians have. He has that sense of creating a dialogue, striking up a dialogue. And I've seen him preside over meetings and people start to confront each other, but he tries to calm everybody down. He tries to unite people and have a sense of reconciliation amongst everybody. And that's something that brings people together. Insofar as the youth is concerned, the Mayan language is learned from modern rhythms, because we have rock in Mayan, cumbia music in Maya. There's another type of music, modern music, that is in Maya. And so through that music, through that rhythm, the young people of Campeche, Yucatan, and Quintana Roo states, they're managing to protect our language, to preserve it. And that's important because music is another vehicle for us to preserve our languages. So that's what a lot of the young people are doing. Obviously, we need to make that music more well-known, but in social media, it's being made public. Previously, we would have to depend on a radio station to air our music. I forget the name, but we would have to depend on radio stations broadcasting us. But now we don't have to wait for anybody. We can use WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram. We have all of these platforms, all of these rhythms, all of these musical rhythms that we can use to express ourselves in our indigenous languages. And that's another way in which young people, the new generations, can contribute to not losing our languages, which is one of the most important characteristics of our community. Perhaps you could read one of your poems if you have one on hand later on. But for now, there's a question with regard to how to incorporate the languages and Mayans in the world of universities, in the academic world. How is that happening? Well, I have to admit that there are certain political issues that I can't avoid mentioning, starting with President Fox. Lakehead was named the head of an organization that would encourage the use of indigenous languages, and I think there were like between 15 to 20 universities were created then by Dr. Eschmekels, who is a specialist in the Mexican educational system. And so they created intercultural universities. And those intercultural universities had a curriculum that focused on safeguarding not just the language, but also the indigenous culture in Mexico. Obviously, while at the same time bearing in mind modern issues for employment purposes. And so there were BA degrees being offered for cultural management, for example, for connected to education. But the idea was to try to enrich the scope of universities offerings at these universities. And so, yes, there are these types of universities in Mexico. In Mexico's private and public universities in Mexico, they're always holding conferences, symposiums, recitals. And so it would seem that the universities have embraced this whole idea. I really can't complain about that. Any other questions? I see Virginia Martinez, Claudia Hernandez. What is the role of translation? What are the pros and cons in between Mayan and Spanish, let's say? Well, the role of translation is a prickly subject. It also depends on how fluent the translator is in the two languages. I mentioned that a moment ago. Are the competencies, the skills of the translators have to be very advanced in both languages. If one of them isn't good, then it won't work out. But what does the word linguistic competency mean in the first place? To know how to read and write a language. That's important. But if we only are only half good at speaking in Spanish and we're only half good at our indigenous languages, then that's when the problems begin. That's when the problems begin. Linguistic competency means that you have to be completely fluent in both languages. In terms of the grammar, written grammar, as well as oral grammar, because that's also an important point, because sometimes you think about the grammar in books, but I'm talking about the living grammar, the grammar that people use, because that changes, because there's a process that happens during the interlocution with others, and that's something even within the same language that happens, and so it's important that we bear that in mind. For example, I've seen how now we have a Maya, which is not general, standard, and I have to admit that. A Mayan in which if the community is far-flung, if it's far from the big cities, they continue to use phrases and terms that are very enriching because they haven't been influenced by Spanish yet. One day, a professor who gave me classes at the National School of Anthropology and History, he taught me syntax 1, 2, and 3. He said he went to Yucatan and he was looking for Hach Maya, which is like the true Maya. And he said that he went to Tisimin and they said, oh no, you have to go to the southern Yucatan. And then he went to South Yucatan and they said, oh no, that's spoken by the Chenes, which is a region in the state of Campeche. And he went there and they said, oh no, they speak it in the Camino Real region. And so everybody was like saying, not me, it's not me, because nobody knew where the true Mayan language was spoken. And reflecting upon that, some colleagues were thinking about who speaks the true Maya. The 16th century Maya has been lost. The Mayan of the 17th century and 18th century has been lost. So what Mayan are we speaking now? We're speaking a Spanish-influenced Maya that's been influenced for a long time. Fortunately, people who live far from the city and who basically just speak between different versions of Maya, that's very helpful so that we can have more knowledge of how Maya is in its different forms of interlocution. The Maya that you speak in a small city is very different from that of a big city or that of a small community. And so this has an impact on the translation. I remember once, for example, that they sent me a text in which it said, the person isn't there. He spoke indigenous language first. The person isn't there. But in my language, it would be expressed differently. And so those differences in the dialect will also have an influence on the translation, which is why we have to be very careful. We can't try to normalize everything, standardize things. The National Institute of Indigenous Languages has a good idea in the sense because we have to also bear in mind the differences in dialects. I have another question, and I would also like to apologize to everybody who's sending questions because we're not going to have enough time to answer all of them. Is there a middle point between indigenous languages and the modern world? And what do indigenous languages have to offer a globalized world? Oh goodness, that's complicated. Well, we have a lot to offer. The first thing I would say is that there are others. We offer to live simply and near nature. That's how we're happy. As my father said when he turned 90, he's 101 now, but when he turned 90, I asked him how had he managed to be so happy and healthy at that age. We asked him, how did you manage to get to 90 being healthy? And he said the following: live with very little and don't carry somebody else's burden on your back. And that's what we do in our communities. We live with very little. That doesn't mean that we're limited or constrained. Rather, live with a sense of decorum. Have what you absolutely need to be happy. That's what my father said. That's what we can offer, amongst other things, in addition to our traditional medicine and our spiritual medicine, to this modern world, to this globalized world. To know how to live with very little to be able to be happy. I don't know if that having and being are always in a struggle, and that will help us to, if we find a way to deal with it, we'll all be happy. We have to understand that what's important is to be happy. That's what my father said. Live with little and don't carry anybody else's burdens. That could be turned into a poem. Or maybe you could read a poem. I'll read one of my poems. This one is entitled The House of Your Soul. It's a very short one. And in Maya it says, the house of your soul. The house of your soul. Your language is the house of your soul. There live your parents and grandparents in that ancient house. Home to your memories lies your word. Do not grieve over the death of your body, nor the death of your soul. Your body lingers on your children's faces. Your soul is eternalized in the glow of the stars. That's one of the poems. And I'll read another one. I'll read another one, which I don't know by heart like the previous one. That was a lovely poem. Thank you. I'll read another one. The vegetable serpent. They're words that my grandfather told me once and I turned into a poem. And it reads as follows in Mayan. The vegetable snake. Vines climb tree trunks, hoping to trap their souls. but the soul of trees lie not in their bark, but in bird songs. That's another one. And this is another one, a very short one. Because I have some longer ones, and these are short. I think I should read the shorter ones first. This one reads in Maya. The secret of birds. He who wants to enjoy the song of birds need not build cages, rather sow trees. The song of birds belongs to all of us. Nobody owns anybody, even when cages are involved. This next one, did I send it to you? No? Okay, so should I read it? Well, this one is entitled Payalchi en Maya. It's a little bit long, and I'll just read a fragment of it in Maya, and then I'll move into Spanish. Okay, they are telling me that I only have 8 minutes left, so... Okay, so it reads... Prayer. You need not be an adult to teach. I see you hidden in the faint smile of my students. When I'm distressed, when my heart aches, they, full of your wisdom, catch my sorrows with a flutter of their questions. Take them to the playground where, secluded in the belly of an old ball, from one foot to another, from one pass to another, torn to shreds by shouting and convulsive ovations, they succumb, imprisoned in the net between the goal posts. You need not be an adult to teach. I see you hidden in the faint smile of my students. And let's see. I'm looking for the poem. Here it is. This one is entitled Between Gold and Mirrors, and it's related to the conquest. They asked me to write it. I don't like to write upon request, but it's not something I usually do. But on this occasion, I wasn't able to say no, because it was the celebration of the meeting of Moctezuma and Hernán Cortés in Zempoala upon the arrival of the Spaniards into Mexico. And so they were celebrating the arrival of the Spaniards here in Mexico. I didn't send it to them prior to the event because it was an official event, and I thought, well, if they liked it, fine, and if they didn't, well, fine too. And so the text reads in Maya, and I'm just going to read a fragment of it, and afterwards I'll move into Spanish. And it reads in Spanish. No, I do not come to witness the surrender of gold and jade in exchange for the radiant spell of deception. If I want to look at my face, all I need do is wash my face with the water of my dreams. Dreams do not lie. They are the fleeting code of a stream of life. Sporadic glimpses of images and voices. Ghosts that return at night, between the thick gloom of memory, eaten at daily by oblivion. No, I do not come to witness the surrender of the tribute with hands full of feathers and flowers. Your bloody hands don't deserve the living eyes of my fragrant bushes and herbs, the copal scroll, and the string of perfumed petals, nor do your eyes that lust for the thighs of my land. No, I am not here to witness the surrender of jewels and precious stones. A man's dearest treasure is not in what his hands show, but in what his heart treasures, to give others. Eloquent gem of his nobility, discreet attire of his virtue. No, I do not come to preside over the surrender of my homeland in exchange for idols and crosses, artifice of cunning, invented to rob the unwary and weak of spirit, that gods and priests, yesterday as today, strip of its original identity. I come with a soul full of rage. Among this crowd of vassals of resignation, the stepchildren of fear, the legitimate children of cowardice and servitude over the ages. Behold, my hands harden and my spirit unrepentant prepares to receive the harassment of your avarice, hidden in your silence, while the gifts of my lord Tlatoani warn broken pockets of your insatiable greed. Today and here, with my anonymous presence, one among others, I come ready to resist the mirage of your promises, armed with a bulwark of my shields and obsidian knives. I defend myself against your pretensions, hidden in the phase of your helmet and Franciscan robe. No, I cannot be the ambassador of the coward who mistakes you for the gods, deities who promise the return of their calendars and miracles. Deities who promise the return of their calendars and miracles while in sacrificial ceremonies, ruthless testimony of useless attachment to beliefs, yesterday as today. The oppressive code of the unfinished conquest is written in blood, gold, and mirrors. Muchas gracias por leer los poemas. Ese poema Entre oro y espejos nos recuerda del impacto del colonialismo y la llegada de Cortés a México. No sé si nos podría hablar un poquito, porque nos quedan nada más 5 minutos, nos podría hablar un poco acerca de cómo la relación entre el colonialismo y los pueblos indígenas y la vida de los indígenas. ¿Sigue evolucionando eso en México? ¿Sigue cambiando en México? ¿Y cómo ha visto que han podido sobrevivir los idiomas y la cultura indígena? Quizás es una manera de recapturar sus pueblos para que puedan seguir con la resistencia. ¿Cómo ve usted ese proceso de resistencia? It's a painful resistance because for many years we were told that everything indigenous had very little, if any, value at all. Still, in certain parts of Mexico and Latin America, there is racism and discrimination. And that is terrible. Truly terrible, because even in the Yucatan, no matter what is said, the political classes, the political elite continues to discriminate us. They continue to make light of us. And that underlies that asymmetric relationship that exists between the indigenous person and the powerful person or the politician that leads to the discrimination. In their discourses, they adore us, but they bury us when talking about the public policies for us are concerned. There are a lot of things that they say, but that don't actually happen. For example, they have cut expenses for indigenous peoples. So what was the point of that ceremony that was carried out for the current president when he took office? We're not asking for privileges. Indigenous peoples don't ask for privileges. We just want to live with a sense of decorum, to survive with little, which is what makes us happy. Once I was asked in Panama when they were celebrating the 100 years of the 100-year anniversary of the Greater Colombia, they asked me to give a speech. And it had been originally going to be given by Dr. Leon Portilla, but he was ill and he asked me to go in his place and read his presentation. It was difficult, terribly difficult to represent such a wonderful man. And he was going to talk about the book called La Visión de los Vencidos, the view of those who were vanquished, which is a wonderful book that speaks about how the people who were subjected to the conquest were affected. And since I didn't have much time to prepare, I thought I would have to reread that book, La Visión de los Vencidos, because I had studied it in a high school. And I said that I wanted to change the title or the topic if I was able to, because I was going to have to travel on a Wednesday, and that same day, or I didn't know originally that the same day that I arrived, I was going to have to give the conference. And in any case, I said, well, why don't we make some changes? Why don't we speak instead of the vision of the people who have been convinced through literature in Latin America? Because I had fragments from other poets and writers from Latin America. And it was like, instead of a vision of the vanquished, it would be the vision of the convinced, those that have been convinced that we can survive, can keep our identities even in this globalized world. And they said, all right, you can make that change. The point is that I got there, I gave the conference, and when it came time for Q&A, somebody asked if there wasn't a contradiction between what we were doing and the Spanish culture. And I said, with all due respect to the ambassador, because the ambassador was there, the ambassador from Spain, his distinguished wife, the consul, and everybody who was there, I said, I'd like to give Spain back its cross and sword, which harmed us so much and has continued to harm us. But I won't give back the Quixote, because the Quixote was crazy, but he didn't kill anybody. And thanks to Cervantes, thanks to Garcia Lorca, thanks to those writers in Spanish languages, we too were able to keep our identities through Latin words.
Gracias. Thank you very much. You have given us so many things to think about today, and we had many people who were, had put their thoughts in the chat pod as they keyed in on certain phrases that you spoke to. And the vision of the Convinced is really, for me as I listened, was really about our resistance and our resilience. But taking the gifts that we have as Indigenous people and working together with all people so that we can continue that learning journey together. I really appreciated you speaking about your father and your grandfather. That poem that you read where they're in you and you will be represented in your children really was beautiful. And I too have had grandparents who lived to 96 and spoke their Indigenous language fluently and wrote it as well. In fact, my grandmother only spoke in Ojibwe. But the things that they showed us, and when we were in the bush together and learning how to set little rabbit snares and set the fish nets and pick berries and tan moose hides in a traditional fashion, learn how to do beadwork. My Cocum was her name, Cocum. She would sit beside and really show us and teach us, and you just felt that love. So as you were speaking, I was myself going back to her memory as well. So miigwech, and thank you for that time. I would like to invite...
Before we log off, I just wanted to quickly say something because I think we've only got a minute or two left. Okay, maybe not even that. Okay, so then I would just like to conclude it by saying the following. We have supposedly 3 names. The name that they give us in the civil registry, then our nickname and our secret name. And I'm going to refer exclusively to my secret name, which I got after a very painful ceremony, and my grandfather said afterwards, a man's name is their burden. If he carries it with a community, it doesn't weigh much. But if you carry it with distaste, it'll tire you out. Keep your name as clean as the inside of your home, because your name is the house of your soul. If you want, your name can be a perpetual light, but if you refuse its dignity, your name, my beloved grandson, will only be a noisy shell that will be destroyed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to now invite President McPherson and Pierre Sved to make a formal presentation of our gratitude and appreciation. President McPherson?
Thank you very much, Denise. And I just want to again echo Denise's words in saying how much we appreciated you presenting these words and your comments and answering the questions today. I also think there were moments of beauty listening to the way you spoke about your language and what that means to you. So thank you very much. And as a small token of our appreciation for you taking the time today and participating in our series, we have prepared a certificate, and I can't see Pierre right now, Denise, but they're fabulous. Thank you very much, Pierre, and we're really honored to have listened to you today and have you be part of this. And please accept this certificate as a token of our gratitude today. Thank you very much, Mr. Peche.
Dib altitud Lakalesh. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes. Takulaki, hasta otro día.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. So it is my pleasure to close our event today by thanking all of you for attending. Thank you for joining us to listen and learn from Jorge Miguel Cocum Peche today as our honored and invited guest lecturer. Thank you to the Canadian Embassy for their support of our event, and for our translator today, Mrs. Teresa Flores, who did an amazing job. And please join us for our next speaker on November 4th if you're available.